In a world where noise often drowns out courage, one young leader quietly walked into a room full of billionaires and changed everything. She didn't shout. She didn't demand. She stood tall, spoke truth, and reminded America that real leadership isn't bought, it's earned. If you still believe in character over celebrity and backbone over bravado, this is a story you need to see. The Pacific Leadership Forum in San Francisco glittered under sterile white lights, a temple to money, power, and polished ambition. High above, glass ceilings stretched into the sky, while below, a sea of sharp suits and curated smiles murmured in self-congratulation. This wasn't just a gathering, it was a coronation, the future, bought and paid for by those who believed they already owned it. The back doors opened, and Karoline Leavitt walked in. No entourage, no designer armor, just a navy blazer worn like a soldier's uniform, a silver cross catching the cold light. She didn't stride, she didn't flinch. She moved with the unsettling calm of someone who didn't need their permission to exist. Heads swiveled. Conversations stuttered, a few sneers flickered. She didn't belong, and that, in this room, was almost an unforgivable sin. At center stage, lounging in calculated ease, Mark Cuban looked up from his notes. His eyes swept over her once, twice, slow, deliberate, before he leaned into the microphone with the smirk of a man who thought he had already won. Someone lose their intern? Maybe the coffee runner missed the turn and found the grown-ups' table. Laughter cracked the polished air. Harsher this time, not nervous, but cruel. The kind of laughter meant to remind everyone of the pecking order. The cameras, hungry for drama, swung to Karoline. Would she stammer? Blush? Turn and flee? She did none of those things. She walked steadily to the long table at the front, the one ironically labeled Emerging Voices in Leadership, pulled out her chair and sat down without a glance at Cuban or the smirking crowd. Calm, precise, intentional. The moderator, Sienna Ward, an old pro who had seen 100 political upstarts crumble under less, faltered for half a breath before recovering. "Let's welcome Karoline Leavitt," she said, voice tight around the edges. White House press secretary and, it seems, a rising voice in the national conversation. The applause was thin, obligatory, almost mocking. Karoline folded her hands neatly on the table, the light catching the glint of her cross again. She wasn't here to be applauded. She wasn't here to be humored. She was here to challenge everything they thought leadership was supposed to look like. And somewhere in that glittering, brittle room, a fault line opened, silent but deep. They didn't know it yet, but Karoline Leavitt had just walked into their world, and she wasn't leaving quietly. The moderator's voice broke the silence with a carefully measured smile. "Let's kick off today's discussion on the future of leadership," Sienna Ward announced, her gaze flickering toward Karoline with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "We're joined by some of the world's most recognized innovators and one rising voice from public service." The polite phrasing barely concealed the undercurrent. Karoline was an anomaly, a political outsider among titans of industry. Across the panel, Mark Cuban leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, radiating the easy confidence of a man who believed he had already won whatever contest this was. "Well," he drawled into the microphone, "leadership in the real world isn't about speeches or slogans. It's about building something, creating value, not just talking about it." The audience chuckled, low, knowing, aligned with the man who had spent decades turning ideas into empires. It was a challenge wrapped in a dismissal. The message was clear. She didn't belong here. Karoline lifted her chin slightly, the only signal that she had even heard him. When her turn came, she didn't clear her throat. She didn't shuffle her papers. She didn't hesitate. "I agree," she said, her voice steady, cutting clean through the noise. "Leadership is about building something, but not just in dollars." The room quieted. She leaned forward, her hands folded neatly on the table. "It's about building trust, building resilience, building the courage to stand when everyone else folds." She paused, letting the words settle like bricks in the foundation of something unshakable. "I may not have launched a billion-dollar company, but I've stood in rooms where fortunes couldn't buy the truth, only backbone could." A ripple moved through the crowd, not loud, but unmistakable. Even a few of the veterans seated near the back, men and women who had built businesses from scratch before the age of venture capital, nodded slightly. Mark Cuban's smirk tightened, just a fraction. He leaned forward as if to interject, but Sienna Ward, sensing the moment, smoothly passed the next question down the line. Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't grandstand. She simply sat back, her presence growing not through force, but through the quiet, unshakable power of having earned her place at the table. And for the first time that afternoon, the balance in the room had shifted, not by wealth, but by will. The discussion flowed into familiar territory. Buzzwords like disruption, scalability, and global footprint filled the air like so much polished smoke. Karoline listened, nodding respectfully, but she didn't chase the jargon. She didn't interrupt. She waited, and that patience would soon hand her a gift. As the moderator turned a question toward Mark Cuban, something about cultivating leadership in emerging markets, he answered smoothly at first, then, perhaps forgetting the live microphones, leaned back and muttered just loud enough for nearby panelists to hear, "She's just noise. Won't matter in 6 months." The words, intended to be private, crackled faintly across the sound system, a ghost slip that filled the dead air between questions. For a split second no one moved. Then a ripple of uncomfortable shifting swept the room. Heads turned, a few phones rose discreetly, some were already streaming live. Cuban's face tightened as he realized his mistake, but it was too late. The damage wasn't in the insult, the real damage was in the assumption behind it, that truth without a billion-dollar valuation was disposable. Karoline could have fired back. She could have seized outrage and ridden it like a wave. Instead, she chose something older, stronger. She rose slowly, adjusting the microphone in front of her with unhurried grace. Her voice was clear, calm, almost gentle. "Did everyone hear that?" she asked the crowd, her tone almost conversational. "Because I want to be very clear. I'm not here to entertain. I'm not here because someone wrote a check with enough zeros. I'm here because leadership isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in whether you stand when standing isn't easy." A quiet murmur of agreement rolled through the audience. Louder this time, more than polite. Karoline's eyes swept the room, steady and unwavering. For every young leader told they were just noise, for every woman who's been talked over, for every voice that didn't come from wealth but from conviction, I'm standing here because of you. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling. This wasn't the kind of polite applause given to celebrity guests. This was heavier, the applause of people remembering what real leadership sounded like. Mark Cuban shifted uncomfortably in his seat, one hand clenching the edge of his notepad. But the moment was no longer his to shape. The room had shifted again, not in favor of the loudest, but in favor of the truest. And Karoline Leavitt hadn't just answered an insult. She had turned it into a mirror. And many in that audience didn't like what they saw. The lobby of the Pacific Leadership Forum buzzed with nervous energy long after the panel ended. Clips of Karoline's poised rebuttal were already circulating online, flashes of her standing alone against a billionaire backdrop, refusing to blink. But while the cameras chased other stories, Karoline quietly slipped away. Inside, the room was simple. No sweeping city views, no lavish welcome baskets, just a laptop, a battered leather notebook, and a mind that understood something Cuban's camp had forgotten. The real battle wasn't fought in the spotlight. It was fought in preparation. Karoline sat at the desk, scrolling through archived interviews, keynote transcripts, old op-eds Cuban had penned during different political and economic seasons. She wasn't looking for dirt. She wasn't plotting a hit job. She was looking for something far more devastating. Contradiction. And she found it, a C-note from 2016, where Cuban had championed the power of the outsider and the courage of those who don't fit the mold. She found an op-ed from 2020 where he warned against valuing polished insiders over raw truth-tellers, statements that stood in stark contrast to the man who had tried to dismiss her as noise only hours earlier. Karoline clipped the quotes carefully, methodically. No emotional tweets, no vengeful posts, no victory laps, just quiet, disciplined preparation. The kind of work ethic you don't learn from fame or fortune, but from years of being underestimated, and years of standing up anyway. Outside the window, the lights of San Francisco glittered against the night sky, cold and distant. Karoline didn't look at them. She wasn't here to be dazzled by the city's wealth or swayed by its applause. She was here to remind them, and herself, that real leadership isn't about reacting louder, it's about standing stronger. When she finally closed the laptop, the evidence neatly organized, she didn't feel triumph. She felt something rarer, readiness. Tomorrow would come, another stage, another confrontation, another chance not to outshout her critics, but to outlast them. And that was a war Karoline Leavitt had been quietly winning long before the cameras noticed. The CNBC studio in downtown San Francisco gleamed under banks of cold, bright lights. Giant LED screens wrapped the set in digital cityscapes, while a scrolling ticker at the bottom of the monitors reminded viewers they were about to witness a discussion on the future of American leadership. On the panel, tech founders, hedge fund managers, and Karoline Leavitt, her navy blue blazer crisp, her silver cross glinting softly under the lights. Across from her sat Mark Cuban, sunglasses perched low on his nose as he reviewed his notes, the picture of studied indifference. But the tension between them wasn't lost on the cameras, or the millions tuning in from living rooms and offices across America. For many watching, this wasn't just another panel discussion. It felt like a test of something deeper. Which version of leadership would America choose to believe in? The moderator, seasoned CNBC host Sienna Ward, welcomed the audience and offered the first volley. Leadership today, she said, requires more than slogans. It demands results. Real-world experience. She turned slightly toward Cuban, giving him the opening he expected. Cuban leaned in, smiling easily. "Look, leadership isn't about sound bites," he said. "It's about who's actually built something that lasts, who's taken the risks, made the payroll, faced the real consequences. It's not speeches, it's sweat." The audience nodded. On the surface, it was a point hard to argue. But Karoline didn't flinch. When the microphone passed to her, she didn't rush, didn't fire back. She waited a beat, letting the air tighten. "Real-world experience matters," she agreed, voice steady. "But leadership isn't just about what you build for yourself. It's about what you build that lifts others too." She paused, scanning the panel. "And sometimes, the people who know the most about resilience, about perseverance, aren't the ones on magazine covers. They're the ones who never had a safety net to fall back on." Sienna Ward, sensing the crowd's shift, pressed further. "Karoline, your critics say you're polished, that your speeches are too rehearsed. How do you respond?" Karoline smiled faintly, reached under her chair, and pulled out 2 pieces of paper. "Funny you mention that," she said, holding them up for the cameras. "Because here's Mark Cuban in 2016, praising outsiders, saying the best leaders are often the ones who don't fit the mold, encouraging them to disrupt, to challenge every room they're in." She flipped the page, and here's Mark Cuban again in 2020, criticizing political insiders, saying true leadership comes from raw experience, not polish or pedigree. The room stirred. Even a few fellow panelists raised eyebrows. She laid the papers gently on the table between them. "So, which version should America believe?" Karoline asked, her voice still calm, still razor-sharp. "The one that cheered for outsiders, or the one that mocks them when they finally walk through the door?" A visible ripple moved through the studio. Cuban's easy grin faltered. He shifted in his seat, searching for a counterattack. But the crowd and the cameras weren't looking at him anymore. They were locked on to Karoline. I didn't come from wealth, Karoline continued, her voice growing in strength but never losing its composure. I didn't build an empire from venture capital. I built a life from perseverance, faith, and the belief that leadership is about service before self. That's the America I come from, and it's the America I still believe in. For a full second, the studio held its breath. Then the applause started. Quiet at first, then swelling until it filled the room. Not polite claps, not staged cheers, real, resonant applause from people who recognized that somewhere in the midst of media spin and political theater, authentic leadership had stood up, without asking permission. Mark Cuban sat frozen, blinking slowly. He hadn't been defeated by louder outrage or a cleverer insult. He had been outmatched by preparation, principle, and patience, values he had once claimed to admire, now standing unflinching before him. As the segment ended and the credits rolled, Karoline didn't linger on stage. She gathered her papers, nodded politely to the panelists, and stepped off the platform with the same quiet, unshakable resolve she had carried in. She hadn't just survived the forum, she had redefined it. And across living rooms in every corner of America, viewers aged 50 and older, many who had built their own lives on faith, family, and work ethic, sat back, nodded slowly, and thought, finally. The studio lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the now empty CNBC set. Producers huddled over playback monitors, resetting for the next program. Guests filtered out, trailing publicists and assistants. Their conversations hushed, their glances lingering on the figure still seated quietly near the stage, Karoline Leavitt. She was checking her notes one last time, not because she needed to, but because discipline didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. From across the room, Mark Cuban watched. For the first time all afternoon, there was no audience between them, no moderator to buffer the tension. He slipped off his sunglasses, tucked them into his jacket pocket, and started walking, slow, deliberate steps echoing against the marble floor. "Got a minute?" he asked, stopping just a few feet from her. Karoline stood, smoothing her blazer, and nodded. She followed him down a side corridor, away from the flashing lights and curious eyes, into a quieter backstage lounge. Dimly lit, spare, the hum of the city muted by thick walls. Here there were no networks, no panels, no performances, just two people, stripped of pretense. Cuban turned first, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharper now, measuring. "You're good," he said flatly. "I'll give you that." Karoline said nothing, waiting, letting him fill the space if he wanted to. "But be careful," he added, voice low, a faint edge sharpening his words. "This whole smart conservative woman with bite thing, people love it. Until you slip, and you will." Still no flinch, no quick comeback. Karoline folded her arms loosely across her chest, the very picture of calm under pressure. When she finally spoke, her voice was cool steel wrapped in velvet. "And what makes you think I haven't slipped before?" Cuban gave a short, humorless laugh. "Because nobody's aired it yet." Karoline tilted her head slightly, studying him like she might study a chess opponent after the game had already been won. "That's the difference between you and me," she said. "You're afraid of exposure. I'm not. I've already been underestimated, mocked, dismissed. And I'm still here. I don't need to hide mistakes. Because my strength never came from being untouchable. It came from getting back up." Cuban shifted, leaning against a counter, his expression tightening. The easy smirk he wore so often was gone, replaced by something heavier. Recognition, maybe. Or regret. "Don't confuse going viral with being right," he muttered, almost reflexively. Karoline stepped forward, not aggressively, but enough to lower her voice without losing an ounce of presence. "And don't confuse money with wisdom," she said, each word deliberate. "You've built a brand, I've built a backbone." For a long beat, they stood there, the air between them thick with an understanding too complicated for applause. Cuban looked away first, exhaling slowly, the bravado slipping further. "You remind me of me," he said finally, almost begrudgingly. "Before? All this? Before the cameras? Back when it still mattered? Karoline didn't blink. Maybe that's why you tried to dismiss me, she said quietly. Because I remind you of what you used to fight for. Cuban met her gaze again, and for once, there was no battle in it, just the weight of two very different roads briefly crossing. He didn't offer an apology. She didn't ask for one. Neither needed to pretend. Karoline turned toward the exit, her steps unhurried, her purpose unshaken. She didn't gloat, she didn't soften, she just moved forward, the way real leaders do when no one's clapping. Behind her, Cuban stayed rooted in place, watching, not as an adversary anymore, not even as a competitor, but as a man who, for the first time in a long time, saw not a threat, but a reminder. And that, more than anything Karoline could have said, was the real victory. The news cycle spun fast after the CNBC confrontation. Clips of Karoline calmly dismantling contradictions, standing her ground without theatrics, flooded cable news and social media alike. Talk radio hosts praised her restraint. Editorial pages grudgingly acknowledged her composure. Yet while pundits debated, Karoline had already shifted her focus. She knew real leadership wasn't measured by trending hashtags or viral clips. It was measured by what you inspired others to believe was possible. The envelope arrived 2 days later, simple, hand-drashed. No media team screening it first. Postmarked from Bakersfield, California. It came from a 16-year-old girl named Emma Callahan. Karoline opened it carefully, the late afternoon sunlight slanting across her White House office, casting long shadows on the carpet. Dear Ms. Leavitt, it began in uneven, earnest handwriting. I watched you stand up to Mark Cuban and I cried, not because you were angry, but because you weren't. You stood your ground without yelling. You didn't blink, you didn't back down. I didn't know we were allowed to do that. Emma explained that she and 4 friends, all students at a public high school where ambition was often laughed at, not encouraged, had started meeting in the library after school. They called it the Stand Tall Circle. No slogans, no protests, just conversations about courage, leadership, and the simple but radical idea that you don't have to be rich, famous, or loud to make a difference. Karoline folded the letter carefully, tucking it into the battered leather notebook she carried, the same one she'd once used to scribble down speeches and prayers during her first campaign job. She didn't hesitate. She called her communications director. I'm going to Bakersfield, she said. No press, no announcements, just me. 3 days later, Karoline walked into the school's empty cafeteria where Emma and her small group sat nervously around a scuffed plastic table. They wore no matching shirts, no prepared statements, just wide, hopeful eyes. For a long moment they stared at her in disbelief, until Karoline pulled out a chair, sat down, and smiled, warmly. You don't need anyone's permission to lead, she told them. You just need your own courage. They talked for over an hour, about standing firm when it's hard, about speaking truth when it's costly, about building lives that meant something even when the world wasn't clapping. When Karoline finally rose to leave, the Stand Tall Circle had more than doubled. Word would spread, as it always did, but that wasn't why she came. She didn't come to be quoted. She came because she remembered being their age, sitting quietly at the back of crowded rooms, wondering if she was foolish to believe her voice could matter. Now she knew better. Now she was passing the torch. And somewhere deep in the heart of California, another generation had quietly begun to rise, not with anger, not with entitlement, but with the unshakable belief that courage, once sparked, could light up even the darkest rooms. A week after her quiet visit to Bakersfield, Karoline Leavitt stood backstage at the National Youth Summit in Nashville. She wasn't the keynote speaker, at least she hadn't been when the schedule was printed. But word of her visit to the Stand Tall Circle had spread, first through school districts, then through regional news outlets, and finally into the national bloodstream. Educators, parents, and young leaders began requesting her by name. They didn't want slogans. They didn't want sound bites. They wanted something real. Under the bright stage lights, Karoline took a slow, steady breath. In her hand was a small note card, just 2 words written on it. Stand tall. She didn't need a teleprompter, she didn't need applause. She stepped into the spotlight and spoke with the quiet, unshakable confidence that had become her signature. I never set out to start a movement, she began. I never asked to be the answer to anyone's doubts. But I know what it's like to be 16, sitting in a room full of noise, wondering if your voice can survive it. The crowd, thousands of students, teachers, and families, leaned in, not because she shouted, not because she promised easy victories, but because she spoke from a place most had nearly forgotten still existed in public life. Truth lived, not just spoken. A girl from Bakersfield reminded me, she continued, that courage doesn't start with crowds. It starts in quiet corners, with a few people deciding to stand even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. The applause swelled, real, heartfelt, the kind that rises not from excitement, but from recognition. You don't have to be loud to lead, Karoline said. You don't have to be rich, or old, or polished. You just have to be ready, ready to mean what you say, ready to build when no one's watching, ready to stand tall when it's easier to sit down. She paused, scanning the faces. The future. They say I don't belong, she finished, a soft smile crossing her face. They say I'm too young, too faithful, too stubborn. To them I say, watch me. The standing ovation that followed wasn't orchestrated. It wasn't manufactured. It was the sound of something long dormant stirring awake. A belief that leadership wasn't dead. It had just been waiting, patiently, quietly, for someone brave enough to redefine it. And in that moment, Karoline Leavitt didn't just reclaim the room. She reclaimed something far greater. The belief that courage, character, and conviction still have a place in America's future. True leadership isn't measured by wealth, fame, or the size of a platform. It's defined by courage, authenticity, and perseverance when no one is watching. Karoline Leavitt's journey reminds us that standing firm on principles, even when dismissed or underestimated, creates lasting impact. Real leaders aren't the ones with the loudest voices or the biggest fortunes. They are the ones who inspire others to rise by living their truth. In a world obsessed with appearances, Karoline proves that backbone, not bravado, is what truly shapes the future.